Very special edition of On the Record this evening. For the next hour, we'll be enjoying a lively and informative debate among the three nominees for one of the most interesting and competitive political races on the ballot locally in this political season. It's competitive and interesting because it is an unusual race because it involves an empty congressional seat. It's the 21st District congressional seat that's being vacated by the retiring Lamar Smith, who is leaving Congress after 31 years in office. So we're expecting a very interesting discussion among the three nominees for that seat coming up in the next hour. This debate is sponsored by the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters San Antonio area is a nonpartisan organization which works to encourage and support the active participation of citizens in their government. For nonpartisan information on the candidates and the issues that are involved in the November 6th election, just go to vote411.org. And now let's meet our candidates. And we will be meeting the candidates in the order in which they will appear on the ballot, that you will see them either when early voting begins next week or if you go to the polls on Election Day on November 6th. Chip Roy is our Republican nominee. His career experience includes working as a federal prosecutor and a federal banking analyst. He served as the first Assistant Attorney General of Texas, the Chief of Staff to U.S. Senator Ted Cruz, and the Senior Advisor to Texas Governor Rick Perry. Mr. Roy, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Joseph Kopser is a U.S. Army veteran and has worked in private industry. Leading up to the 2018 primary election, he was serving as president of the advisory and analytics firm Grayline, as well as a member of the Defense Council of the Truman National Security Project. He's a former member of the board of directors of the Greater Austin Chamber of Commerce and the chairman and co-founder of Bunker Labs Austin. Mr. Kopser, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Lee Santos is the Libertarian nominee for this seat. She is a retired businesswoman who currently works as a beer hops farmer. She describes herself as a hardcore libertarian, and she's also a black belt in Kenpo karate. So I'll know who to turn to if this debate gets out of hand this evening. Couple minutes on the ground rules. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to respond to each question, and then if you wish, each candidate will then get a 1-minute rebuttal. Please do me a favor and stick to the time because we have a lot of issues to discuss, as you well know, and we want to make sure that everybody's opinion is heard, respected, and appreciated. So thank you in advance for going along with these rules. And let me start with the first question. Do you think the deficit is a serious problem facing this country today, Mr. Roy? And please explain your position.
Absolutely. First of all, I really want to appreciate you all for hosting this debate, the League of Women Voters, KLRN for putting us on television, allowing the voters to be able to hear from all the candidates, and thank you very much. Also want to send our prayers and thoughts for those that are affected by the flood waters that are obviously ravaging central Texas, and make sure that people are heeding warnings and staying out of harm's way. The deficit is obviously a very significant problem. $21.5 trillion of debt is currently what is hanging in the balance for our children and our grandchildren. Unfortunately, neither party is serious about stopping the spending problem in Washington, D.C. I think that we need to, in Congress in January, Congress ought to convene, and they shouldn't leave town until they've passed a 5-year balanced budget and appropriated to that budget. It's something that can be done, but unfortunately there hasn't been the seriousness and the resolve to deal with the spending issues on Capitol Hill. The president sent a 5-year balanced budget up to Capitol Hill about 18 months ago. But what you saw was a failure to take it seriously from either Republicans or Democrats, and they laughed it back to the White House. I think that we need to have people who are serious about this issue in Washington and will take it seriously and look across the options in front of them and figure out how to balance the budget like every human being, every person, every family, every state has to do throughout the country. Families have to do it. And unfortunately, that $21.5 trillion, that represents about $175,000 per taxpayer. So that's something we do not want to saddle with our children and our grandchildren.
Mr. Kopser, what are your ideas on dealing with this budget issue?
Well, we first have to recognize, and before I go into my answer, I want to also thank the League of Women Voters for organizing this event and KLRN for hosting, because it is important that we talk about all these issues. And when it comes to the deficit, this is an issue that will have long-term implications in a number of arenas. So first, starting with national security. As a member of the United States military for 20 years, I know full well that it is a large budget that we consume, and it's necessary to be able to be a part of the national security apparatus to keep us safe. But it has been said time again that a growing deficit that consumes even more and more of our money just to maintain it through interest alone, that long term needs to be solved. Secondly, as a business owner here in Texas, growing a company, creating jobs, it is unfair that there's a different set of rules for those that work in Congress from those that actually grow companies. What I want to see is a new generation of people like myself who are business owners, who understand the private sector, who can go in and make hard decisions like I did in business with hiring and firing and having to make ends meet with the money we had available. That is what Texas families have to do. Those are Texas values. And if we're going to take it back to the kitchen table, why is it that in Congress, both Democrats and Republicans can go to D.C. and not have to think about the long-term implication on parents and on kids and the grandkids that are to come? I want to see responsible steps taken, and last year's tax bill went too far. It cut too deep, and we're already seeing now that it's cut into our ability this year to be able to balance our budget, and even more so the tax that it made on our healthcare system to remove the individual mandate was a further example of chipping away at what we need, which is a long-term solution.
Ms. Santos, what's the Libertarian take on the budget deficit currently facing this country?
Well, I don't think my mic is on. Hello, can you hear me? I believe that the wars that we're currently paying for example, the Afghanistan war that's been going on for 17 years and is really benefiting nobody except for military contractors, businesses over there. These kinds of things that us taxpayers are paying for are causing a giant deficit we cannot afford, as well as other things such as Space Force, a wall on the border. We cannot even afford one brick on a wall, let alone an entire wall. The deficit is so out of control. Our children inherited this from the Democrats and the Republicans, and it's not fair to have saddled them with this debt.
Thank you. Anybody want to come up with a rebuttal to any of the comments that you've just heard? If not, we'll move on to the next question. And Ms. Santos just mentioned a wall, so here's the million-dollar question in the minds of a lot of voters, and that is immigration. And I'll start with you, Mr. Kopser. What is your take on the current immigration issue? Everything from whether or not we need greater policing and a wall on the border to what should be done about the dreamers, who are young people who have lived in this country without legal citizenship or residency for much of their lives. What is the proper solution to these immigration issues which have vexed us for so long?
Well, the proper solution is actually sitting at the table, Democrats and Republicans alike. But I know for a fact that we have not had real comprehensive immigration reform in over 40 years in this country since President Ronald Reagan actually set forth. What I want to make sure we can do as a country is respect our values, which is a welcoming nation. For those immigrants like my German ancestors coming to this country for a better life, for those workers that are coming here for jobs and opportunity to help their family, or those seeking amnesty to be able to escape the violence like the drug war going on in Central America. But we can do all of that and give dreamers the status that they have been promised, to be able to give them the certainty so they can stay here, they can live here, they can work here and raise families. But we can do all of that while also at the same time maintaining security at our borders. One of the best proposals is by Dennis Nixon, the CEO of IBC Bank here in Texas. In fact, a big Trump supporter, but he is very clear that a wall is not the answer. The answer is better security and better entry point management. And that means at our entry points, we should be able to have more adjudication, more capacity, and more ability to be able to understand for what reasons people are coming and help them process through the system. Meaning that in between those border entry points, people that are coming into this country for reasons of trafficking of drugs, of humans, of weapons, they can be apprehended by our Border Patrol with the least force necessary. Using technologies that I saw firsthand in the military can be deployed along our border without militarizing the zone, but still being able to detect people coming across. It's a fascinating report, but most importantly, we are a good and welcoming country, and we need to maintain those values as Americans and as Texans.
Ms. Santos, we know already that you don't support a wall as a libertarian. What's your idea for keeping illegal immigrants out of the country without construction of a border wall?
Well, I believe that all people entering the country should have proper citizenship documentations if they plan on staying here. But if they don't, I believe that we should encourage them to get their citizenship, and we should consider a pay-to-stay system similar to other countries have adopted, similar to a golden visa in which you can actually pay for citizenship in several other countries at this time. With the amount of people that are coming into this country, I believe that we can tap into that as money that can be put into our national debt and help pay that down. Of course, people need to be vetted as well. That's going to be a very important process.
Mr. Roy, you've made border security one of the centerpieces of your campaign. What's your take on what we should do about illegal immigration and the Dreamers?
Well, first of all, I've been blessed to go spend a lot of time with some of the folks who are on the front lines, with the Border Patrol who are down in the Laredo sector in particular. I went and visited with, and of the 72 miles of the Laredo sector, you know, how many miles would one think has not fencing or a wall, but actually even a road that allows you to navigate the Rio Grande parallel to the river? Only about 2 miles. Sitting in the vehicle down by the river, one of the agents said, look, I'm down here at 11 o'clock at night. I don't have a cell signal that works. I don't have a radio that works. I'm by myself. I can't see the river because the cane is so thick. And we know the cartels have operational control of the other side of the river. He said, this is not a way to do business. We can't do our job to secure the border. And this is, I think, what we're seeing is the problem. And we need to be serious about solving the problem. Having a strong border and strong border security is actually good for our nation in terms of the sovereignty, good for our workforce and having a steady stream of workers that we know that we can have and predict what we need in labor supply, but also it's good for immigrants. Right now, our broken immigration system and our failure to secure the border is causing children to get sold into the sex trafficking business. It's empowering cartels to use those children. It's empowering MS-13. It's causing children to ride on the top of train cars to come here. That's unconscionable. As a country, how can we allow ourselves to let that happen? And this is something that we can solve if we work together to do it. We had legislation this summer that would have gone a long ways to provide the security and the assets needed, the cameras, the radios, the fencing, yes, the border walls, the roads along the river. We would have had that. We would have had an immigration system that was merit-based, point-based, would have solved the labor needs. And it also would have dealt with some of the people who are here. But here's the thing, not a single Democrat supported the bill, not one. And even different versions of the bill that were weaker on security and actually went even further in terms of providing paths to citizenship. Not a single Democrat supported it. And you have to ask yourself why. I think we all need to focus on our job as a country, secure the border, make sure we have an immigration system that works, and then that will be in the best interest of all involved.
Mr. Kopser, would you like to respond to that?
Absolutely. So one of the things said by my opponent, I think really is a telling moment about where we are in Washington, D.C. The piece of legislation proposed by the Republicans was not perfect, but it was okay. But it is indeed true that none of the Democrats supported it. But much of that comes from the legacy of infighting between both parties, where they're more likely to want to score political points than to focus on moving it forward. And the case in point that I want to highlight is that these issues have been discussed for 40 years. When we talk about the issues at the border and putting fencing, that was actually tried back during the Bush administration, but there wasn't a clear answer to what to do about the fact that most of that land along the Texas border is actually owned by private citizens of the U.S. We need to get past the partisanship, and that's why I believe it's time for a new generation, people willing to come out of different career fields to help this problem. My opponent, on the other hand, has a lot of experience in Washington working for a lot of these people, but I believe it's time for a new kind of experience, and I'm willing to return to public service to do just that.
Mr. Roy, do you feel that your experience in Washington is a negative?
I've been proud of my service in the private sector, in investment banking, in the oil and gas industry, as well as my public service, and I'm proud of that. I take that experience and go to Washington knowing what works and what doesn't work, and I've seen firsthand. If you go back to the immigration issue, and we talk about going back 40 years and referring to President Reagan, yes, President Reagan did work through an amnesty in 1986. It was supposed to be about 1 million. It turned into being about 3 million. And President Reagan later said he regretted doing that without getting the kind of border security necessary to stop the problem. And now we have 11, 15, 20 million, depending on how you look at the numbers, people here are here illegally, which is bad for them and bad for our country. So what about fencing? In Southern California, in the 1990s, there was very little fencing on the southern border, and we had 600,000 apprehensions a year. Now we have triple-layer fencing, and we have about 30,000 apprehensions a year. We can find the right places to use fencing, to use technology, security, Border Patrol agents having the assets they need to do their job, and respect private property rights, but also secure Texas's border and America's border.
Moving on, Ms. Santos, you'll get the first crack at this question, and that, of course, is the very, very critical issue of health care. Do you see health care as a right or a privilege in this country? And who should provide health care? Should the government provide it through an Obamacare or a Medicare for all type system? Or is it up to private industry, or is it up to the individuals themselves? What's your and the Libertarian philosophy on how to deal with the health care issue?
I believe that the entire industry should be privatized. I was victimized by the Obamacare when that occurred, and I found myself without health insurance, my entire family, for 2 years. I was paying for premiums for insurance that did not exist. When I tried to use it, they had no idea who I was and said I had no insurance. And yet I was still forced to pay for it. Something as simple as my Social Security number, the last digit was off by one number, and they never could get it right. For 2 years, I was on the phone constantly, day in and day out. It became almost like a part-time job. I had slipped through the cracks, and during that, I also had my entire family's identities hacked at the IRS. I was notified by them that somebody had tried to hack in and find all of our personal information, and eventually, false credit card applications were filed in my name.
So the bottom line is you feel that it is not the government's responsibility to provide health care to anybody under any circumstance?
Absolutely not. They screwed up. Too bad.
Mr. Roy, this is a hot issue facing Republicans. Where do you stand on this?
Well, 7 years ago this last week, I was declared cancer-free at MD Anderson after going through stage 3 Hodgkin's lymphoma. I've looked personally firsthand at what the healthcare system looks like and at how it impacts people. My dad is a polio survivor. He's had polio for 70 years. We know what healthcare looks like. I had to pay $1,900 a month for my family for Cobra when we went to the private sector. We have got to fix the healthcare system. Obamacare has obliterated a healthcare system that, while imperfect, was at least built around the idea that people should be able to access doctors of their choice and be able to have the kinds of market-provided healthcare opportunities that America would normally provide. But instead, what we've got is Obamacare, which has shoved 15 million people on the Medicaid payrolls, on the Medicaid rolls, which is causing people to be on waiting lists, waiting for care, people who genuinely need it. And it's not actually working. When President Obama says 20 million people were covered, shoving people in the Medicaid rolls isn't coverage. What it's done is it forced people off of their insurance and off of the plans that they had. My opponent likes to often say, you know, what then? What next? When you have an idea or when you're talking about a solution. Well, what happened after President Obama promised that nobody would lose their insurance? What happened when President Obama promised that everybody's premiums would go down? The reality is that premiums have doubled. They've tripled. There's upwards of 35 to 40% of American counties where you can only get one insurance provider or 0 insurance providers. You've got people who are paying, exceedingly high cost of health care and unable to get access to that care under Obamacare. We can solve that problem. People need to have access to their physicians, direct primary care, health savings accounts where they can take their money and increase transparency in the cost of health care. Make sure that you have health sharing ministries and health sharing organizations where you can spread out costs, and insurance that's portable and that's catastrophic and that you can take from one job to the next. And if you do that, drive down the cost, increased transparency. That's the way the American system works to provide better health care.
Mr. Kopser, Medicare for all has become a rallying cry of many Democrats. Is that your position?
Well, health care for all is my position. Medicare for all doesn't actually have the votes right now in the House or the Senate to get passed. So what I want to do is take pragmatic steps to make sure that the greatest nation in the world extends to all the care that they should have as a citizen of this country. And here's a couple of ideas. First and foremost, we need to understand that for all those critics who say, how are we going to pay for universal health care or health care for all? The answer is simple. We already are paying for it. We are good and decent people, and when someone shows up to the county hospital, regardless of health care coverage, we're going to make sure they're cared for. Who pays that cost? You and I do, the taxpayer. And so what we have was, in the past, before the Affordable Care Act, an imperfect system. And then when President Obama came in, and by the way, I have faults for how he did it by leaving the prescription drug companies out of the mix, by leaving the health insurance industry out of the mix. But what he did was base that plan on a Republican plan out of Massachusetts, Romneycare, built on the theory by most conservative and Republican think tanks that said we will never be able to reduce costs overall until we have some kind of an individual mandate. Everybody has to be in the system, whether they're paying directly themselves or it's coming from the government, but everybody has to be in the system. So while my opponent likes to say, oh, immediately afterwards it changed and you couldn't go see your doctor, come on. The Republicans played loosey with the football every single time. They removed individual mandates. They removed or trying to pre-existing conditions. They never gave it a chance to work from the start, and rather than throw it out with a plan that they don't have other than sometimes health ministries, which, by the way, if you have pre-existing conditions, good luck with that. But more importantly, what I want to see is a real plan that improves the existing system and provides the same care that I provided in business for my employees and as I had in the military, which was care for everyone in my family.
Mr. Roy, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. Medicare for all, which my opponent has publicly supported, not just health care for all, but Medicare for all, would result in really Medicare for none. We know Medicare's going to be bankrupt in about 8 years, and we need to get busy making sure that it's solvent for those lives who are dependent on it. The reality is that Medicare for all would cost upwards of $32 trillion by even left-leaning organizations such as the Urban Institute that have decided that it would cost that much. We know what that would do to our economy. That's basically spending the size of our economy every year into the future. And, you know, if we think about what that actually does to people, it's going to force people to have to be in wait lists like we've seen with Medicaid, what we're already seeing happening in states where Medicaid has been expanded. And let's talk about pharmaceutical costs and what we could do there if we were to eliminate right now the safe harbor provision from the anti-kickback statutes. You could drive down pharmaceutical costs right now. There are things we could do on a bipartisan basis to solve health care instead of bankrupting the entire economy and bankrupting the healthcare system through Medicare for all.
Moving along, Ms. Santos, do you have anything you want to add?
No.
Okay.
Well, I would like to rebut that.
Okay.
So, and thank you for the opportunity to rebut it, because what I heard my opponent say is that Medicaid and Medicare could be made bankrupt after several years if everyone's on it. Well, I just want to be very clear. We have right now a Senate Majority Leader who announced yesterday, Republican Mitch McConnell, that because we now don't have as much revenue in the government and because of that tax cut they pushed, the Republicans are going to have to take a serious look at Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and its long-term solvency. So what you have is, again, Lucy in the football. There's no plan. There's no backup. If you get pre-existing conditions, you're out of luck. Unless, of course, you happen to work for Ken Paxton, and then you can work out a deal like my opponent did. You can read about it in the Dallas Morning News and take his words, which is he kept his health care because he needed health care. I want all Texans to have that health care, not just ones who get sweetheart deals from Ken Paxton.
Let's move on to the next question, and this is for you, Mr. Roy. What's your position about what we can do to stop the problem of gun violence in our schools, on our streets? What's your position on guns generally? Where should we go from here?
Well, I appreciate that question. Our Bill of Rights are critically foundational to the ability of all Americans to live by their God-given rights, and the Second Amendment is obviously one of those. I believe that we should be able to defend our families, defend our nation, unfettered by the regulations by some who would like to, as Rahm Emanuel would often say, never let a crisis go to waste. And, my opponent likes to say that he supports gun rights, but yet if you look at his website during the primary, when perhaps it was maybe more popular to do so, he said, quote, "The only reason a private citizen can accurately use or justify owning an assault-style weapon or high-capacity magazine is that he or she is seeking to commit mass murder and violence on innocent American lives." Now his website says, "I cannot imagine any reason why someone would want to buy assault weapons and large-capacity magazines." He's softened that language. Now, understand politically why that might be the case, but the fact is that he was basically targeting law-abiding citizens who have weapons that they use to defend themselves, and then basically saying, oh, they must want to go commit mass murder. The fact is that 75% of the mass murders that we've seen over the last 20 years, if you go look at the data, have been caused by people who have grown up in broken homes. We've got a broken society where we're having people grow up in homes that are one-parent homes, where there's drugs, where there's problems. And if you look at that, you see that there's a correlation to that. We've got to get back to fixing civil society and making sure that we've got a climate in which we're raising people that can understand how we respect each other's rights and won't go down the road that we've seen some of these go down.
Mr. Kopser, you've been accused of being a flip-flopper on this issue. What is your position?
No, my position is very simple. In May of 1993, I joined the United States Army, and in that time, I raised my hand and swore an oath to the Constitution of the United States, and that includes all the amendments to include the Second Amendment. And I want to be crystal clear here. All responsible gun owners have nothing to fear from me as a representative. In fact, it's been accused by Ted Cruz and others that I'm coming to grab their guns. I just want to be very clear. There was a time that I grabbed my gun every time I left my vehicle in combat in Iraq. I did grab my gun every time we left the wire to go out into the streets of Iraq. There is a difference between the weapons of war over there and the need for civilians to be able to feel safe in their homes. And those civilians should feel just as safe, whether they're in schools or churches or places of worship, and beyond that, movie theaters, you name it. So here's what we do. Common sense gun reform. Over 70% of Americans already say, gun owners included, that they want to restrict weapons from the hands of criminals and terrorists and those that are beating their family members, and most importantly, those that are not in their right mind. The Command Sergeant Major James Pippin, who I served with in Iraq, he has in his home, like his right allows him, more weapons than probably Walmart sells in a day. We don't agree on many of these issues around the Second Amendment. He would want to have more liberty and freedom. I want to have more understanding of the fact that we can balance the Second Amendment with also understanding the fact that sensible gun control, like making sure that people are on the no-fly list, are also not able to buy, making sure that we close the loopholes at our gun shows. And those people, those that are responsible gun owners, have nothing to worry from me as their representative in Congress.
Mr. Kopser, if I could follow up on that, Ms.
Please.
Santos, I'll get to you in just a second. So do you support red flag laws?
Anytime we have a situation to be able to determine that someone should not have a weapon. The best example was a woman I met in San Marcos. After she heard me speak about many issues, she followed me outside and said, "Sir, if you get to become a congressman, try to add one line to the background check, and that is call an immediate family member. Because had they called me, my son would be alive today. But because no one called me, I wasn't able to share with them that my son was not well. He committed suicide weeks later, and he's no longer on this earth." There are plenty of things that we can do to ensure safety for all and protect the Second Amendment.
Ms. Santos, the Libertarian position on this very, very contentious issue.
Well, I fully support the Second Amendment. We are safe gun owners, and I come from a hunting family. So, but the changes that I would make, number one, I would definitely want to eliminate all bump stocks, and I would also want to increase the age to purchase rifles and guns to 21 years old. If you would like to use those weapons prior to turning 21, I suggest you join the military, because there's plenty of opportunities there for that. As far as protecting the schools, I have kids in school right now, college and high school, and it terrifies me daily. And I've talked to teachers, and their recommendations to me were to institute some type of a satellite office next door to schools with cameras and protection there, police with their guns right next door where they can monitor school parking lots and the comings and goings and be right there in case assistance is needed.
Mr. Roy, if I could follow up with you, raising the gun buying age to 21, eliminating bump stocks, what's your feeling about that?
Well, I think if you want to look at the problem that we're trying to deal with, right? My children were less than a mile away from where the bombs were going off in Austin, Texas. And I can tell you how, as a dad, we responded and how the families responded around the schools and the communities and wanting to make sure our schools are protected, showing up the next day, having conversations about what we need to do to make sure there's a heightened police presence, making sure there's the kind of security measures that should be put in place. And I believe very strongly those should be done. But I can tell you, as a former federal prosecutor who has prosecuted criminals who have misused firearms, put them behind bars for the very litany of things that my opponent, Mr. Kopser, just outlined, the kinds of activities that you should be prohibited from having a weapon. I can tell you that that's how you go about solving the problem. And I've done it. I've sat in court and we've made sure that people who shouldn't have weapons don't, and they're behind bars for engaging the kind of activity that led to that. And so that's what I think we need to be focused on, is making sure that people who shouldn't have weapons don't.
Mr. Kopser, moving on to the next question, and this is an interesting one, especially considering our times today. Where do you stand on the role of the federal government on women's issues? Everything from abortion to sexual harassment to the Me Too movement. What is the federal government's role in all of those issues involving women today?
Well, I think what the first thing that the federal government can do is buy the individual actors inside of that government, from civilian employees to appointees to elected members. They can all do a better job of leading by example in treating people with dignity and respect, and under no circumstances, regardless of political party, ever finding it appropriate to mock or to try to humiliate publicly on stage in front of others a sexual assault survivor. So the first thing the federal government can do, and I hope to do in Washington, is lead by example. But that leading by example includes some very basic tenets, like understanding that support for a woman to choose in all aspects of her personal health is important, and that we need to preserve that. But going forward, when the issues of health care go beyond just her and whether or not it ends up in society itself, we have to understand that her choices extend beyond just health care. It's where she works, when to start a family, where she wants to live, the schools. She should be just as able to walk down the streets in safety as any man. She should be able to walk late at night with any fear, without any fear that a man wouldn't have himself. So we can do a couple of things. Leading by example, as I did in business. The key leadership positions in our company were led by women. They were at the forefront in our campaign. It is led by women, the campaign manager and all the directors. If we empower women in a way that they are able to lead and demonstrate their capability just as good as any man, we won't need government regulations to empty even the playing field, because by their leadership alone, we will see it. People will be what they can see, and having opportunities to have women out front, whether it's in our own family with my three daughters, Keaton, Hadley, and Piper, the way my wife have tried, it is about leading by example in the end.
Ms. Santos, gender equality, abortion, where do you stand on these very key issues?
Well, of course, I support the rights of all lesbian, gay, transsexual, and bisexual people. I have a transgender family member who served in Afghanistan and returned and transitioned into a woman, and she proudly served our country 2 tours. And I'm so proud of her. And of course, I am pro women's choice. I support the women's rights to choose what they choose to do to their own bodies, whatever that may be.
Mr. Roy?
One of the greatest role models of my life was my grandmother. She was a single mom in West Texas in 1949 when my grandfather, who was a chief of police of Sweetwater, Texas, passed away of cancer when my father was 7 years old, and my father had been diagnosed with polio. So here was my grandmother, who was alone now, and raising my 7-year-old polio-stricken father and my 2-year-old uncle, and she had to figure out what to do. And she took multiple jobs, figured out how to get up early in the morning, take my dad to therapy, help him walk, figure out how to continue to raise her boys as a single mom. And then she ran for office. She ran and became the first woman elected county clerk in Nolan County, Texas, which was a big deal in 1950, 1951. And I learned from her. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to get into public service. It's the kind of thing that inspires you and motivates you. And I've been very proud throughout my career to, in my way of hiring and my way of viewing things, try to blindly hire the people who are best for the job. And in doing so, have hired women to be the legislative director for Ted Cruz, for example, the executive director of my current campaign, women throughout the Office of the Attorney General. But again, with an eye towards hiring the best for the job, which often cases are women. And I believe that that's fundamentally important. But I would be remiss in saying that I think it's equally important that we stand up for unborn women and making sure that we're protecting life at every stage. I think that is critically important, and it's one of those things that would guide me in office.
So you would support measures that would make receiving an abortion more difficult?
I believe that life is precious. I believe that we should protect life. And I certainly don't believe that we should be funding Planned Parenthood to the tune of $300 to $400 to $500 million a year when they're now using upwards of $30 million of that to go after politicians. Why are they taking taxpayer dollars in order to go after folks? When in fact, Planned Parenthood performs 83 abortions for every one adoption referral in 2017. Planned Parenthood killed 887 unborn children every day in 2017. Planned Parenthood's market share for pap smears in 2015, less than 1%. And they're responsible for less than 2% of all women's cancer screenings. So these are the kinds of things that I think ought to change. I don't think taxpayers ought to be funding that.
Mr. Kopser?
Oh, I fully support Planned Parenthood. And right now, what we have is a problem in this state of Texas, where while the Texas state legislature wants to make it harder for women to receive health care, at the same time, they're doing everything to restrict their ability to have everything from prenatal care to the counseling that they've needed. They've actually gone a step that's probably worse, which is allow the funding of organizations that are masking as organizations to help these women, when in fact, what they're doing is try to scare them away or not even show them all the options they have, or worse yet, the gag issues. It's groups like Empower Texas that are here in the state of Texas, led and funded by people on the very far extreme right, that if you look at the actual financial filings, are giving money to my opponent. That is no direction I want to take this state, and I want to come to a more moderate place led by people like Joe Strauss, there's Republican Speaker of the House, who is trying his best to hold the center while the extremes are pulling it in different directions.
Ms. Santos, do you have anything you want to add to this?
I support the idea of standing behind Planned Parenthood. I was a customer for many years, and I was very appreciative to have that as an option for me as a young woman.
Ms. Santos, you get the first crack at the next question, and once again, it's a doozy. What's your position on human-caused climate change? Do you believe that it's real? And if you do, what do we as a society need to do about it?
It is absolutely real, and I believe that we need to really transition into more electric charged vehicles. I'm a big V8 driving woman. I love my trucks. I love my sports car. But the fact is that oil is killing us. The price of gasoline, when we have many resources available to us for electric cars. I'm a big recycler. I came from Boulder, Colorado, some of the earliest recycling known in this country. We, at our repair shop, instituted many ways to make our business green by recycling oil filters, crushing the oil out of them before they were disposed of, recycling that oil in oil heaters that heated our entire shop. We recycled all of our cardboard, our trash. We're throwing away massive amounts of food that could be made into mulch. There's so many ways. I believe that more people should be recycling. We really need to push that effort forward and stop throwing away so much.
Mr. Roy, here in a state that is now producing more than 4 million barrels of oil a day, do you feel that human-caused climate change is a justification for cutting back on the use of fossil fuels?
Well, there are seven and a half, whatever billion people in the world. So the idea that human beings don't have some impact on the environment is something that I think would be questionable. But I don't think that's the right question to be asking. I mean, the question here is what kind of regulation do we want to put in place, and what is the impact on the quality of life? Life expectancy around the globe, the entire globe, has more than doubled since the mid-1800s. And that draws a very strong correlation to the advancement and the availability of abundant energy, abundant, affordable energy. That has truly transformed the entire way of life and advanced the human condition. It's literally powered our lives, powered hospitals, made it possible to have clean water, made it possible for people to be able to have all of the advancements we have today in medicine, heavily as a result of that availability of power and having affordable. And I think if you think about the world, of course there's climate change going on, right? There has been since the beginning of time. And as the climate has changed, the question is how can humans adapt to it? Energy is the very thing that allows us to adapt to it, to be able to have climate-controlled places in which to live and operate, in order to have the tools that we need to be able to do to operate. And what we're doing in Texas right now, through innovation, through the ability of people to get natural gas and be able to export that natural gas, we're actually transforming the entire world. Liquefied natural gas has the ability to change the world immensely with respect to carbon production and the emission of CO2. As long as Texas continues to lead the world in innovation, as long as we continue to be on the cutting edge, we can truly transform the world so that instead of having 54 million people in Europe choosing between heating and eating because of the over-regulations, and having 1 billion people around the world who don't have access to clean, abundant energy, we can actually transform that. And I think I'm really proud of the president who has taken on the so-called Clean Power Plan and the so-called Paris Agreement, because now we have the ability to have low-cost, affordable energy for all.
We'll have to move on, Mr. Kopser. Should we adapt to it, or should we as a society do more to fight climate change?
Well, let me go back to the premise of your question about whether or not it's real, and I want to speak directly to the residents of Texas 21. I happen to believe climate change is caused by people, but you don't have to. But here's where I think we can agree, which is what I want to do in Congress, which is find consensus. That Harvey, a 500-year storm that was followed a year later by more 500-year storms, is because of the warming temperatures in the Gulf. So we don't even have to worry about the source of what happened. We've got to get at making sure that we are doing everything we can to move off of fossil fuels that are accelerating the speed that this is happening. But the best part is it's not just going to be able to save lives like it did or can on the coast, but it will create jobs in the state. Texas was an energy leader for the last 100 years, and it is poised perfectly to be a leader for the next 100 years. We are building more jobs in solar and wind here than any other state. And I appreciate my opponent for pointing out that there's a lot of innovation in energy, because I've been a part of it. The work I did with my company was just to reduce the amount of people driving in a car by themselves, to make it so that roads are less congested, so that there's less emissions coming out of that tailpipe, making it more efficient. But it's also the nonprofit I started in the Defense Energy Summit. When I got to Iraq, I realized that much of the reason we're there is our national security strategy is wrapped around Mideast oil. Not necessarily Americans, but the world market needing it. Soldiers from Military City, USA are in the Middle East to preserve the free flow of Mideast oil, and we have to end that. And the best way to do that is to be more energy sustainable back home. That means having a portfolio that includes not just oil and gas, but wind and solar, creating jobs right here. I've been a part of that in the private sector, and I want to go to Washington, D.C. and scale that nationwide.
Thank you, Mr. Roy. Next question for you. We keep hearing that the next war that we face here in the United States will be a cyber war, and there's even talk that the cyber war has already begun, with actors from Russia to China taking advantage of our reliance on computer networks. How important do you feel it is that the Defense Department and the country as a whole ramp up to deal with the possibility of a cyber war, and what ideas do you have to help that ramp up happen?
Well, it's obviously a great question here in San Antonio. San Antonio is right at the heart of and the epicenter of cybersecurity and leadership thereof. UTSA has obviously got some of the best minds in the world in dealing with cybersecurity. And importantly, obviously, we have Joint Base San Antonio, and we've got all of the great minds here that can help advance that going forward. Most importantly is in Congress, we've got to make sure that we keep the Joint Information Operations Warfare Center, make sure that we've got all of the assets that are important, not just for San Antonio because it's parochially important, but because we know that's advancing the cause for American cybersecurity. That's something that we know is on the cutting edge of the attacks that we're going to see from foreign nations that want to do us harm. And so we know that it's a critical part of what our United States military is focusing on. The Futures Command Center now coming to Austin, the ability to have that partnering with all of the great minds here in San Antonio, that's something that we need to continue to advance. And particularly if there's any discussions, for example, in a future BRAC, which, by the way, I think a BRAC is a good conversation to have, but we know that we're going to protect the assets that we have in San Antonio because they're so valuable and important to the overall cause for the health and well-being of our military, both in the healthcare front and cybersecurity, as we're pointing out here. So those are the things that we'll continue to advance the cause for American defense.
Mr. Kopser, you fought in a shooting war and you've also run a tech company, so you're pretty well positioned to answer this. Where do we need to go as far as dealing with some of these actors out there trying to hack us?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, when Chip was describing the talent that's here in Texas that understands tech in the military, I almost blushed a little bit. I appreciate that because that's where I've been my entire military career. As an aerospace engineer coming out of West Point, I looked to find every technology solution to fight the future wars. In 2 assignments in the United States Army, I was a part of figuring out what the Army after next looks like. But in combat, I understand the limitations we have today. But be very clear. The opportunities we have in this district with Joint Base San Antonio, with the civilian network of cyber opportunities to be able to allow those people in the military who we have invested so much with our tax dollars to then keep them here in the economy in Texas, to grow more jobs, to be able to create new companies like the one that I built here in Texas, focused on using technology to help lives. And as far as the future, we do have a new opportunity. We're moving from an industrial age army of tanks and bombs to an information age army and military, where we're focused on using cyber and digital to thwart those opponents before they even dream of doing us harm. And the fact that I had the honor of being a part of the group of committees of chambers of commerce to be able to help attract the Army Futures Command, the first new 4-star command in 40 plus years in the United States Army, to be able to figure out how to fight the Army the problems of the future, and to have been a part of that here in the private sector and in the military, please give me the chance to go to Washington, D.C., oversee this opportunity, and provide not only the cheerleading, but the criticism when necessary to keep it on track. And with somebody with a technology background, I assure you there will be nothing missed in terms of making sure we get the most efficient return on investment possible with our tax dollars.
Ms. Santos?
I adopted my son from a former Russian orphanage when he was a baby, and I lived in Kazakhstan for a month and a half, experiencing life as a Russian in the former Soviet Union. And I can tell you that they are not our friends. They rule with fear and intimidation, and they're absolutely not to be trusted as far as they could be thrown. We had signs in our hotel room that said, please hold your personal and business conversations out in the hallway. Our phones were tapped. We were escorted by police. The KGB had my passport almost more than I did while I was there. And the same goes for China, where I adopted my youngest daughter and lived there and traveled all throughout China. And the same could be said about that communist country. In fact, I drove right past the communist headquarters in Nanning, China. There again, communist countries, they've got their own political agenda, and it's very crooked and in some cases even evil, as we've seen even recently with what's happened with the Saudi journalist. So
we're reaching the end of this very interesting debate. I do want to make sure that everybody has time for a closing statement. I'd like to hear from your own mouth and in your own words how you plan on improving the lives of the people in District 21. And let's keep it to maybe 2.5 minutes. And Ms. Santos, how about if you go first?
Well, the first things that I would like to accomplish, number one, is my goal is to put an end to the Afghanistan war. That's a big goal of mine. I'm a peace-loving hippie from the old days, and I support peace all the way. And number 2, I want to legalize marijuana. I am the legalization candidate. I believe I am pushing for it. I'm pushing for full legalization for as much as you want, for whatever the use you deem to be. I don't care if it's for mental, physical, spiritual. I don't care if you smoke it or vape it or put it in your hair or rub it on your feet. It doesn't matter to me, and we've got to stop putting people in jail for that. It's costing us too much money in police enforcement and also jailing these people in expensive jails. And also, I really want to help improve students who need to start learning some technical skills to get into the workforce and be ready to start learning some trades like air conditioning and electrical and mechanical and different things like that. We're really lacking in those fields right now, and there's not enough qualified people to fill those positions. So we need to get some people trained and filled in those spots.
Mr. Kopser, give us your closing argument. You got 3 minutes.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thanks for hosting this. And I want to thank Lee and Chip for joining us this evening, and again, the League of Women Voters for being a part of this. So this is a very important election coming up, and voting starts in 4 days. And it's over in 19 days. But the work will go on beyond that. And the question you have to ask yourself as you're going into the booth or you're talking with friends, am I going to continue the trends of party partisanship, or were you willing to take an opportunity to look for people who are a new generation, who have not grown up on the Republican team or even the Democratic team, but in my case, people come from other teams, like in my case, the Army team. We're looking for people who are willing to go to Washington from day one, ready to solve the problems by working with people across the aisle when needed to be able to bring calm out of the chaos. The issues that we've talked about here tonight, immigration and jobs and education and making sure that we're safe nationally in cybersecurity and across our borders, in business, these are all the issues that I've dealt with in the real world. I am returning to public service because I want to make a difference. Problem solving is what I have done since a kid. It's what led me through 20 years in the Army after West Point, took me in and out of my 2 tours to Iraq, but most importantly, during that time, listening to the platoon sergeants and first sergeants who taught me that if you take care of your soldiers and give no concern for promotion or looking ahead, but every day in and out looking out for the people that you serve, everything will work out just fine. And then in business, trying to find a solution to traffic and congestion to be able to reduce the amount of time you spend in traffic and spend more time with family, like I was trying to do with my 3 daughters, Keaton, Hadley, and Piper. I am not going to Washington, D.C. for any one particular party. I am prepared to push back on both sides when necessary. I get flack from all sides because I'm not pure enough for any group, and I think that probably tells me I'm doing something right. Because what you need to know and your friends need to know is whether or not I can go to Washington and represent you instead of a party, as some of you are afraid. And let me end with this thought. If I can cross oceans and deserts in service to this country and leave my girls behind, if I can do that, believe me, I can cross the aisle when needed to work with others to solve the problems in Washington. I'm Joseph Kopser, and thank you for tuning in tonight.
Mr. Roy, you're an attorney. Give us your summation. 3 minutes.
Well, Jim, thank you. Thanks for hosting this. Thanks for KLRN, and thanks to the League of Women Voters and everybody who's here and the crew who made this happen. And thank you to my beautiful wife, Kara, who's at home with my son, Charlie, who's 9, and my daughter, Virginia, who's 7. Thank you all, and thank you for the sacrifices you're making. And I know the families of my fellow candidates and the sacrifices they're making. I'm running for Congress because, as I said before, when I got through the other end of cancer, I felt committed to recommit myself to public service and make sure that I passed down a republic to my children that was even better than the one that I inherited. I want to make Congress work for us. I want Congress to work for the people. I want Congress to reflect our Texas values. Those are Texas values that were shaped by me, or shaped for me by my family. My family who came to Texas, came to Hays County, came to Dripping Springs, where my family currently lives. In 1851, one of the first families there. And my great-great-grandfather was a Texas Ranger. He signed up to deal with the Comanche hostilities at the time. It was a tough time. It was a tough place in Texas, settling Texas in that time. And I'm proud of my family. And those are the Texas values that shaped me. The same values I mentioned before when my grandfather out west passed away from a cancer and it caused my grandmother to be a single mom and to raise my polio-stricken father and run for office and become the first woman elected. Those values shaped me. Those are the values that I think people want reflected, that can-do attitude, the stuff that makes Texas great. The reason why 1,000 people a day are moving to the great state of Texas. The woman that I met in Bernie just a few weeks ago who came up to me and she said, "You've got to win. You've got to make sure that we protect Texas. Please help protect Texas from Washington because I've got nowhere else to move." She had just moved here from California 2 weeks before. That's the story of Texas. That's the story that I want to perpetuate going forward. The Texas values when I talk to people: secure border, an immigration system that's welcoming so long as you follow our laws, and a rule of law that's enforced. A healthcare system that's affordable so you can get to the doctor of your choice without interference from an insurance agent's bureaucrat or a government bureaucrat. And making sure that we balance the budget the responsible way we should future children and grandchildren. These are the things that I will do in Washington. These are the things that I'm been blessed by the good Lord to have the opportunity to learn from a lot of great people on how to do that, and what will take up my time and focus in representing the people of Texas 21. I'm asking for your vote and your support. As Joseph said, we've got the early voting starting Monday, and I really appreciate the time, and thank you guys for hosting this.
Chip Roy, the Republican, Joseph Kopser, the Democrat, Lee Santos is the nominee of the Libertarian Party. The choice is yours, and thank all three of you. I am always impressed when I do these debates at the high quality of individuals who are willing to put themselves out in the line to represent the people of Texas. And thank you very much for running. The choice will be yours. Early voting begins next week. Election date is November 6th. Thank you to the League of Women Voters San Antonio area for sponsoring this debate. I'm Jim Forsyth, and join us again next time for On the Record.
Gear up to hear some of your musical favorites at the Majestic Theater. Lord of the Dance delights on October 21st. KLRN favorite Celtic Thunder performs on December 1st. Mannheim Steamroller keeps you in the holiday spirit on December 29th. And on March 19th, 2019, see the Beach Boys in concert. More information at majesticempire.com.